The mountain was an anvil, and Elias was the iron that had been beaten upon it for 10 solitary years. His cabin clung to the granite slopes like a stubborn lichen, a testament to a man who had chosen the harsh indifference of stone over the fickle cruelty of men. The wind, a constant and mournful preacher, spoke of nothing but survival, its voice scraping through the gnarled pines that stood like sentinels of his isolation. Every dawn bled across the eastern peaks, a fresh, raw wound that reminded him of the life the valley below had stolen, the wife and daughter lost to a fever and a town's apathy. He was a man carved from the very heartwood of his grief, his silence a fortress, his self-sufficiency a penance. He moved with the quiet deliberation of someone who had unlearned haste, his days a long, slow rhythm of chopping wood, checking traps, and staring into the distance, a landscape as vast and hollow as the space they'd left inside him. His heart was a locked room, the key long since rusted away. But the sky that day decided to turn on him. Not with the honest fury of a summer thunderstorm, but with the cold, insidious betrayal of a late autumn blizzard. Snow began to fall, not as gentle flakes, but as a blinding vertical torrent. A white curtain dropped upon the world with malevolent speed. The air grew teeth, biting and sharp. It was in the midst of this sudden, violent descent into winter, as he fought his way from the woodpile to the cabin, that his world tilted on its axis. Through the swirling chaos, he saw a flicker of movement near the ancient, wind-twisted fir that marked the edge of his clearing. A trick of the eye, he thought, a phantom born of loneliness. But the shape huddled and shifted, and it was not one shape, but 3. He plunged through the deepening snow, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. There, sheltered feebly in the lee of the great tree, were 3 small girls, triplets, their Apache heritage clear in their dark hair and high cheekbones, now rendered ghostly pale by the encroaching frost. They were a knot of shared desperation, clinging to one another, their thin cotton dresses a mockery of the storm's power. They did not cry out. They simply stared at him with ancient, dark eyes, their terror too deep and too cold for sound. And in that instant, the iron of Elias's resolve cracked, and the man he had buried 10 years prior clawed his way back to the surface, raw and exposed. Before we dive further into the story, don't forget to like and comment down below where in the world you are watching this story from. Now let's get back to the story. Elias lifted them from their snowy grave, a strange and terrible trinity in his arms. Their combined weight was nothing, yet it felt heavier than all the sorrows he had ever carried. He kicked open the cabin door and stumbled inside, the sudden warmth of the hearth a shock to all of them. He laid them on the great bearskin rug he had cured himself, a relic of a louder, prouder time in his life. Their stillness was a terrifying counterpoint to the howling symphony of the blizzard outside. For a man who had perfected the art of being alone, the sudden, fragile presence of 3 small heartbeats in his sanctum of grief was a cataclysm. He moved with the practiced competence of a frontiersman, yet a tremor ran through his hands as he gently peeled away their frozen, pathetic garments. He wrapped each of them in his thickest wool blankets, their small, icy limbs a haunting echo of the daughter he had once held, a memory he kept chained in the deepest dungeon of his mind. He worked with a grim focus, stoking the fire until it roared with defiant life, its light dancing on their still faces. He brewed a thin broth from dried jerky and herbs, spooning the warm liquid past their cracked, blue-tinged lips. They took it without protest, their eyes following his every movement with a silent, unnerving intensity. They were not children in that moment. They were survivors, wild things brought in from a world that had tried to erase them. The storm outside raged on, a perfect metaphor for the tempest now churning inside him. The cabin, for so long a vessel of silence, was now filled with the almost imperceptible sound of their breathing, a delicate rhythm that pushed back against the wind's fury. He found himself unable to look away, watching the rise and fall of their blanket-covered chests, a primal, long-dormant instinct of protection stirring in his gut. He had thought that part of him was dead and buried. He sat in his worn armchair all night, his rifle across his lap, a stoic guardian against a threat that was no longer outside, but within his own reopening heart. The wounded hero was being summoned from his exile, not by a cry for help, but by the profound, demanding silence of 3 small, broken birds. Dawn broke pale and fragile over a world transformed, a landscape of blinding white and crystalline silence. The storm had passed, leaving an unsettling peace in its wake. Elias stood at the cabin's small window, the steam from his tin cup of coffee fogging the glass, his mind a turmoil of new and terrifying responsibilities. The girls were awake, huddled together on the rug, the raw fear in their eyes having cooled to a hard, watchful wariness. They communicated in a language of shared glances, a silent fortress from which he was excluded. It was then that he saw her, a solitary figure moving with a slow, agonizing purpose across the vast expanse of snow. She was a single, dark brushstroke against a canvas of white. Elias's hand went instinctively to the rifle leaning against the wall, his body tensing. He watched as the figure resolved into a woman, her Apache braids long and dark against her worn leather tunic. Her face was a mask of exhaustion and desperate resolve, but she moved with a straight-backed dignity that defied her apparent destitution. She stopped 20 yards from the cabin, her chest heaving, her gaze locked on the door. It was the mother. He knew it with a certainty that settled deep in his bones. He opened the door, a plume of warm air rushing out to meet the cold. He stood there, a mountain of a man blocking the entrance, his face unreadable. Her eyes, for a fleeting second, darted past him to the fire, to the 3 small bundles on the floor, and a shudder of profound relief ran through her body. But she did not collapse, did not weep or beg. She held his gaze, her own dark eyes assessing him with an intensity that matched his own. Her name, he would come to learn, was Tala, and she was the very definition of a resilient survivor. She was not asking for charity. She was here to reclaim what was hers. The air crackled with unspoken meaning, a negotiation of trust and intent held in the space between them. He finally gave a slow, deliberate nod and stepped aside. It was all the invitation she needed. She walked past him into the warmth, her movements fluid and purposeful. She knelt, murmuring in the soft, flowing cadence of her language, and her daughters melted into her embrace, the silent fortress finally lowering its gate. She then looked at Jedediah, at the blankets, at the empty broth bowls. She dipped her head once, a gesture not of subservience, but of acknowledgement. A truce was struck, a fragile alliance formed between 2 wounded souls in the heart of the unforgiving wilderness. Tala did not ask for a place, she made one. She rose with the sun, and the aroma of coffee, stronger and richer than Elias had brewed in years, was the first sign that the cabin's long slumber was over. She moved with a quiet efficiency that was both astounding and unsettling. She found his meager supplies and created nourishing meals. She took his discarded scraps of leather and began mending the children's worn-out moccasins, her stitches small and perfect. She did not offer words of gratitude. Her actions were her currency, and she paid her debt with a quiet competence that slowly, methodically, began to push back the tide of neglect in Elias's life. She was a force of nature in her own right, a spirit of order and resilience that refused to be broken. Elias watched this silent transformation, his initial suspicion giving way to a grudging, then a genuine respect. He was a man who understood the language of hard work, and Tala spoke it with a poet's fluency. Yet the true thaw came not from the woman, but from the children. Morning Sun, Whispering Reed, and Little Sparrow, their names, like them, were gentle and wild. They were the catalysts, their innocence a solvent for the hardened shells of the 2 adults. One afternoon, as Elias sat on his porch sharpening an axe head, Little Sparrow, the most curious of the 3, approached him, her small hand outstretched. In her palm lay a single, perfect hawk feather. Elias froze, the rhythmic scrape of stone on steel falling silent. His own daughter had once brought him dandelions, her face alight with the joy of a simple treasure. The memory, usually a sharp stab of pain, was different this time, softened by the small, hopeful face before him. He carefully set down the axe and took the feather, his large, calloused fingers brushing against hers. It was a fleeting touch, but it sent a tremor through the foundations of his fortress. Later that week, drawn by an impulse he couldn't name, he went to the old wooden chest at the foot of his bed. From its depths he pulled a small, smooth object, a bear carved from dark walnut, its form worn soft by the touch of small hands that were now dust. It was a sacred relic of his grief, a symbol of all he had lost. He felt a presence and turned to see Whispering Reed standing silently in the doorway, her dark eyes full of a solemn curiosity. He didn't speak. He simply held out the small wooden bear. She stepped forward and took it, her tiny fingers closing around the worn wood. The shared, silent acknowledgement of this totem, this symbol of fatherhood and loss, was a more powerful connection than any conversation could ever be. The story of their flight was not a flood, but a slow, painful trickle, emerging in the quiet hours after the children were asleep. Tala's words were sparse, each one chosen with care, yet they painted a vivid, harrowing picture. They were running from a man named Silas Croft, a former army major who now wore the veneer of a government land surveyor. Croft was the human antagonist in their drama, a man whose soul was rotted with greed and a casual, ingrained cruelty. He coveted the small, sacred patch of land by the river that had belonged to Tala's people for generations, seeing it not as a home, but as a trivial impediment to his ambition. To Croft, she and her daughters were less than human, obstacles to be cleared. The rising tension in the narrative became a palpable thing, a third presence in the quiet cabin. It was the slow-burn dread of knowing that this man, this monster, was out there hunting them. Tala spoke of his escalating threats, his attempts to starve them out, to frighten them away. The final, unforgivable act came when he arrived with papers, declaring the children wards of the state, destined for a school that was nothing more than a prison designed to bleach their souls of their heritage. He said he would make them civilized, Tala whispered into the crackling firelight, her voice laced with a cold fury. He would have taken their names, their language. He would have taken their spirits. That night, she had fled into the teeth of the coming storm, choosing the mercy of the wilderness over the certain damnation of Croft's civilization. As Elias listened, his own past rose up to meet her story. He saw the face of the town doctor who had refused to travel to his homestead for a sick child, dismissing it as just a squatter's fever. He felt the phantom weight of his own daughter's small, hot hand in his. His grief had been born of nature's indifference and man's prejudice, the same cruel forces that now hunted this woman and her children. The open loop of her past was closing, revealing the villain at its center, and in doing so, it was unlocking the door to Elias's own walled-off trauma. The cabin was no longer just a shelter, it was a potential battleground. And the question that hung unspoken in the charged silence was whether this stoic, wounded hero had the strength to fight for someone else's family, having failed to save his own. A new existence took root on the high mountain slope, a fragile but determined ecosystem of four. The landscape, once the canvas of Elias's solitude, became a shared territory of labor and learning. He took Tala to a hidden meadow and taught her the heft and kick of his Winchester rifle, watching with a quiet pride as her aim became steady and true. In return, she led him through the dense pine forests, her knowledge of the land a revelation. She showed him the fungus that drew out infection, the roots that made a nourishing tea, the bark that could soothe a fever. Her wisdom was an ancient song, and he, for the first time in a decade, found himself listening. Their dialogue was one of shared tasks and meaningful glances, a language more intimate than words. When a late frost threatened her small, burgeoning garden of scavenged herbs and vegetables, he spent the night helping her cover the delicate shoots with burlap, their shoulders brushing in the cold, dark air. They moved in a silent, coordinated rhythm, a partnership forged in the shared will to protect something new and precious. The children were the beating heart of this new world. Elias, his hands remembering a forgotten craft, carved 2 more animals from scraps of pine, a wolf and an eagle. He presented them to Little Sparrow and Morning Sun, completing the set. The sight of the 3 girls, each clutching a small, wooden totem, ignited a warmth in his chest he had thought long extinguished. He found himself laughing, a rough, rusty sound, as he watched Little Sparrow try to teach a skeptical goat to shake hands. He would sit on the porch steps, showing them how to fletch an arrow with a hawk feather, their small heads bent together in concentration. The cabin, which for so long had echoed only with the ghosts of the past, was now filled with the sound of life, of soft humming and childish laughter. This was the building of a new life, the slow, careful construction of a home where a homestead had once stood. But even in the warmth of their growing bond, the shadow of Silas Croft lingered, a cold premonition on the horizon, a reminder that the sanctuary they had built was as fragile as a seedling in spring. The arrival of Silas Croft shattered the peace of a perfect afternoon. The sun was warm on the high peaks, and the air was sweet with the scent of pine. Croft rode a magnificent black horse, its coat gleaming, a stark symbol of the wealth he had wrung from the land. He did not hail the cabin or wait for an invitation, but dismounted with the proprietary air of a man who believed the world was his to claim. He was the embodiment of arrogant power, his tailored coat and polished boots an insult to the rugged honesty of the mountain. Elias met him on the porch, positioning his body as a living door, a silent barrier. Tala and the girls were inside, their sudden silence a palpable weight behind him. Croft's eyes, the color of chips of ice, raked over Elias with contempt. "I'm looking for my property," Croft stated, his voice devoid of warmth. "An Indian woman and her litter. They ran off from the reservation. I've got a warrant for their return." The words were designed to wound, to dehumanize, to assert his dominance. Elias remained motionless, his face a granite cliff, weathered and unreadable. His silence was a weapon Croft did not understand, and it clearly unnerved him. "Don't play the fool with me, old man," Croft sneered, taking a step closer, his hand resting casually on the butt of the pistol holstered at his hip. "I'm an agent of the United States government. Harboring fugitives is a federal offense. Give them to me now, and I'll forget I ever saw you." This was the climactic confrontation, a collision of two worlds. It was the civilized sadism of Croft against the wild, protective morality of Elias. In that moment, Elias was not just defending Tala and her daughters, he was defending his own rediscovered soul. He was standing against the ghost of the town doctor, against the memory of his own powerlessness. The arc of his character, from wounded recluse to steadfast protector, had reached its zenith. The long, slow burn of the narrative had led to this single, explosive point. The mountain held its breath. The only sound was the thrumming of blood in Elias's ears, a battle drum for a fight he had unknowingly been preparing for his entire life. He would not step aside. He would not fail again. The fragile peace of the mountain shattered in an instant. Misreading Elias's stony silence as fear, Croft's lip curled into a triumphant sneer. "Have it your way, then," he said, his hand dropping to his pistol. The movement was fluid, practiced, but Elias moved with the explosive speed of a rock slide. It was not the brawling of a saloon, but the brutal, economic grace of a predator. Before Croft's fingers could close around the polished grip of his weapon, Elias's arm shot out like a striking snake. His hand, as hard and unforgiving as the mountain itself, clamped down on Croft's wrist. A sharp, sickening crack echoed in the still air, a sound louder than a gunshot. Croft let out a strangled gasp, his face contorting in a mask of shock and agony, his arrogance vanishing like smoke. With his other hand, Elias plucked the pistol from Croft's holster and sent it spinning into the thick brush. He then shoved the man hard. Croft stumbled backward, tripped over his own fine boots, and landed in the dust with a pathetic whump. The entire, violent ballet had lasted less than 5 seconds. Elias stood over him, a towering figure of quiet fury, Croft's own rifle now held loosely in his hand. The pace of the story, so long a slow and deliberate burn, had accelerated into this punchy, decisive climax. When Elias finally spoke, his voice was dangerously low, a gravelly rumble that seemed to come from the very bedrock of the mountain. "Her name is Tala," he said, the words falling like stones. "These are her children. This is their home." He worked the lever on the rifle, chambering around with a definitive check. "You have no property here." He gestured with the rifle barrel toward the black stallion. "Get on your horse. Ride back down the way you came. And if your shadow ever falls on this mountain again, I will bury you where you stand." The threat was not delivered with anger, but with the cold, hard certainty of a promise. Croft, cradling his broken wrist, his face pale with fear and humiliation, scrambled to his feet. He hauled himself onto his horse and spurred it into a frantic, clumsy retreat, a broken man fleeing the wilderness he had tried to tame. Elias stood, unmoving, until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely, leaving only the whisper of the wind. He had not just banished a man, he had banished his own ghosts. The violence receded as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a silence that was profound and altered. The air itself seemed to hum with the aftermath of the confrontation. Elias turned from the empty trail and faced the cabin door. The world had been reduced to this small patch of land, to the 4 souls within it. This was the final act, the extended resolution where the emotional wounds could at last begin to heal. Tala stood just inside the doorway, where she had witnessed everything. Her face was a storm of emotions, terror giving way to relief, relief giving way to a fierce, burning admiration. The children peered out from behind her, their dark eyes wide, no longer with fear, but with awe. Their protector had faced the monster and had won. He walked past them and placed Croft's rifle high on the stone mantelpiece, a symbol of the victory, a declaration that this home was now and forever under his protection. He turned back to Tala, the space between them charged with everything that had happened, everything they had become to one another. Words were insufficient, and they both knew it. Tala stepped forward, her movement deliberate and solemn. She reached out, not to touch him, but to offer him the only reward that held any meaning in their shared world, a gift far more precious than land or gold. "The people," she began, her voice soft but strong, "give a name to a man not for what he is called, but for who he is, for what he has done." Her eyes held his, a universe of gratitude and understanding passing between them. "We would call you Ewanakata," she said, the syllables beautiful and strange on her tongue. "He who guards the mountain." The name settled over him like a warm blanket. It was not just a name, it was a story, a history, a belonging. It acknowledged the fortress he had built around his heart and honored the man who had finally emerged to defend others. It was an odd reward, intangible and priceless. It was acceptance. It was family. For the first time in a decade, a tear traced a clean path through the grime on Elias's cheek. He did not fight it. He simply stood there, under the weight and the grace of his new name, and gave a slow, deep nod of acceptance. The stoic, wounded hero was finally, truly home. In the seasons that followed, the name became the man. He who guards the mountain shed the last vestiges of the lonely, broken Elias. The homestead thrived, no longer a place of solitude, but a haven of quiet joy. The slow, contemplative pace of their new life was a healing balm. The narrative of hardship and survival transformed into one of peace and creation. Tala's garden expanded, a vibrant tapestry of green against the gray stone. The children's laughter became as much a part of the mountain's soundscape as the cry of the hawk and the whisper of the wind through the pines. He taught them to read the signs of the forest, to understand the language of the seasons. She taught them the songs of their ancestors, weaving a future from the threads of two rich pasts. Their bond, his and Tala's, deepened in the silent spaces between words. It was in the way he brought her the first wildflower of spring, and the way she mended a tear in his coat before he even knew it was there. It was in the shared smiles over the heads of the children, and the comfortable quiet of sitting together on the porch, watching the stars ignite in the vast, dark sky. The emotional arc of their story, which had begun in a somber and tense world of hardship, had found its hopeful, heartwarming, and uplifting conclusion. They had found more than safety. They had found community in each other. They had built a family not of blood, but of spirit, a testament to the resilience of the human heart. The story of the lonely mountain man is a reminder that even in the most profound isolation, the seeds of connection lie dormant, waiting for the right storm to break them open. It shows that the deepest wounds can be healed not by forgetting the past, but by using its strength to protect the future. If this story moved you, and you believe that family is a thing you build, not just a thing you are born into, then subscribe for more tales of redemption, resilience, and the enduring power of the human spirit. Feel free to leave us suggestions or feedback on how to improve the next videos.